There was a new buzzword and narrative that I'm seeing touted around by Western media when it comes to Africa and in particular the AES countries of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And in this video, I'm going to highlight what this narrative is and how sophisticated and subtle it is in the shaping of the perspective of the AES countries, particularly for the everyday person outside of the continent of Africa. This is really important because I believe these types of narratives are what sets up the justification for military interventions and regime change operations without the pushback of the general public in whatever country that is pushing this agenda. So if you're interested in understanding how the narrative is being manipulated against Africa by the West, stay tuned. For those of you that don't know, my name is TJ. I am Nigerian and British mixed. And on this channel, we talk about African geopolitics. As many of you know, I grew up mostly in the United Kingdom and I took it upon myself to come to the continent of Africa to start a new life. That journey has led me to uncover just how naive I was around the way that Western countries, colonial powers, and countries that do not have Africa's best interests at heart meddle in the affairs of Africa for their own benefit. And this concept today is a clear example. I'm sure we're all familiar with the term blood diamonds. You had Jay-Z and Kanye West make a song about it. You had the movie Blood Diamonds starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Well, now that term is being co-opted in a new phrase called blood gold. Let's get into the information. I came across this BBC article titled "How Blood Gold is Fueling Conflict in West Africa." Let me read you some key parts that show exactly what's happening here. The article says, for the governments of West Africa's Sahel region, the stakes are even higher. Gold is a lifeline for the military juntas of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, who are beleaguered by jihadist insurgencies, regional isolation, and the ravages of climate change. It goes on to say, gold prices have been at a historic high. The military governments are hoping that they will be able to benefit directly. Here's another key part. Together, the three Sahel states produce around 240 tons of gold per year, according to the World Gold Council's estimates, or about $15 billion at the current market rate. The article then frames this as problematic, suggesting and inferring that governments using their own gold reserves to fund their regimes is not only fueling conflict, but the proceeds do not trickle down to the everyday miner. Dr. Vines, who formerly worked as a blood diamond investigator for the UN, is concerned that gold has become Africa's new main conflict commodity. Although this article was written only yesterday, this isn't the first time we've heard this narrative. Many of you will remember the viral moment when General Michael Langley, head of US Africa Command, appeared before the US Senate committee a few months ago. During that hearing, he specifically brought up Ibrahim Traoré's use of gold resources. Langley framed Burkina Faso's nationalization of their gold mines and removal of Western mining companies as a negative development. Now we're seeing this exact same framing appear in mainstream Western media, like the BBC. When rebels steal diamonds to fight governments, we call them blood diamonds. When governments use their own gold to run their countries, we now call that blood gold too. The word blood makes you feel scared. It makes you think of violence and death. When they say blood gold, they want you to picture innocent people suffering. They want you to feel angry at these African governments. They want you to think these leaders are evil for controlling their own gold. Blood diamonds were about rebel groups stealing diamonds to fight against governments. The rebels were the bad guys. The governments were the victims. The whole world agreed that rebels stealing resources was wrong. So we created the Kimberley process to stop blood diamonds. The Kimberley process is a certification system that tracks diamonds from mine to market. It guarantees diamonds come from government-approved sources, not rebel groups. Now, they've flipped the script completely. They're using the same emotional word blood, but pointing at the governments instead of the rebels. Before, rebels using stolen resources was bad. They've hijacked the concept and turned it upside down. And it's like one day Michael Langley is complaining about African governments controlling their own resources. The next day, Major news outlets are talking about blood gold. See how that works? This is how military strategic concerns become humanitarian concerns in Western media. African governments assert sovereignty over their resources. American military commanders call it a security issue. Western media reports it as a human rights crisis. People start believing that African governments controlling their own resources is somehow evil. Let's look at the numbers. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger together produce 25% of Africa's gold. That's a massive amount. Burkina Faso alone produces about $6 billion worth of gold every year. But their entire national budget is much smaller than that. Where does all that gold money go? It goes to foreign companies and foreign countries. These governments said enough is enough. They want their gold money to build schools and hospitals in their own countries. They want to create jobs for their own people. They want to process their gold in their own refineries instead of shipping raw materials to Europe. Apparently, this makes them evil according to Western media. The BBC article talks about how these governments are fighting jihadist groups. They need money to buy weapons and pay soldiers. They need resources to protect their people from terrorists. But when they use their own gold to fund their own military, suddenly that's blood gold. Western corporations are losing billions of dollars in profits. So now they're fighting back with information warfare. The narrative is spreading across all Western media outlets. It's not just the BBC, Reuters, mining.com, and other outlets are all pushing the same story. They're all using the same language. They're all framing African resource sovereignty as a threat to peace and stability. But here's what they're not telling you. The people in these countries support their governments. When Mali kicked out the French, crowds cheered. When Niger expelled American forces, citizens danced with joy. These aren't dictators oppressing their people. These are popular movements for economic independence. The Western media wants you to ignore this support. They want you to think these governments are illegitimate. They want you to believe that Africans can't manage their own resources. They want you to think that Western control is better for African people. This connects to a much bigger pattern. In the 1960s, they said African leaders were communists. In the 1990s, they said they were corrupt dictators. Now they're saying they're funding conflict with blood gold. The same pattern is happening with uranium in Niger. Niger has some of the world's largest uranium deposits. France has been getting cheap uranium from Niger for decades. Niger's government said they want to control their own uranium. They want better deals. They want more money for their people. Now watch what might happen next. Western media could start talking about nuclear weapons. They might say Niger wants to build bombs. They could say uranium in African hands is dangerous. They might create fear about African nuclear programs. This is the same playbook they used in Iraq. First, they said Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Then they invaded to stop the threat. Later, we found out there were no weapons. But by then, Western companies controlled Iraq's oil. The same pattern could happen in Africa with uranium and gold. The psychological warfare is designed to make you question your own governments. They want Africans to think their leaders are corrupt and dangerous. They want the diaspora to stop supporting African independence movements. They want you to believe that Western control is better for Africa. But look at the facts. These countries are building gold refineries for the first time in their history. They're processing their own materials instead of shipping them raw to Europe. They're creating jobs and keeping wealth at home. They're using gold profits to pay off debt and buy military equipment to protect their people. Norway has a huge oil fund worth over $1 trillion. They use oil money to benefit their citizens. Nobody calls it blood oil. Alaska gives every citizen money from oil profits. Nobody calls it blood oil. But when African countries do the same thing with gold, it's suddenly blood gold. The legal reality is clear. Under international law, countries have permanent sovereignty over their natural resources. This is a basic principle of international law. Countries have the right to control their own minerals. They have the right to change mining contracts. They have the right to nationalize industries. Western media is trying to make you forget these legal rights. The timing of these articles is not random. Every time an African country nationalizes resources, negative articles appear in Western media. The part about Michael Langley's public testimony that most people missed is that they openly admit to having a propaganda strategy as part of their efforts. They call it information operations. These blood gold articles fit right into that strategy. This is coordinated information warfare. The language they use is carefully chosen. They don't say resource sovereignty or economic independence. They say blood gold and instability. They don't say nationalization or better contracts. They say seizing assets and threats to investment. Every word is designed to make you feel negative about African control of African resources. Source laundering is another trick they use. A military commander expresses strategic concerns about losing influence. A Western think tank writes a report about the concerns. The think tank has funding from defense contractors, but they don't mention that. Then mainstream media quotes the think tank report as if it's independent research. The military concern becomes academic analysis, becomes news fact. This is how manufactured consent works. They create the impression that multiple independent sources all agree about the same thing. But if you trace it back, it all comes from the same strategic interests that are losing influence from African independence. The broader information ecosystem includes multiple pressure points: economic pressure through sanctions and investment restrictions, security pressure through terrorism narratives and military threats, humanitarian pressure through human rights concerns and blood gold stories. They attack African governments from every angle at the same time. The terrorism narrative is particularly suspicious. These countries are fighting real jihadist groups. But some of these terrorist attacks happen at very convenient times for Western interests. When a country is about to sign a good deal with China or Russia, suddenly there's a very well-funded terrorist attack from a group that live in the bush. The timing is often too perfect to be coincidental. Digital age technology makes this information warfare much more powerful. Social media amplifies these narratives instantly. Military strategic concerns become viral humanitarian crises within hours. Hashtags and trending topics can be manipulated to create the appearance of grassroots outrage, but much of it is manufactured by the same interests that are losing influence from African independence. In a previous video, I highlighted a disturbing trend of fake AI videos featuring Ibrahim Traoré speaking in perfect English. These videos get hundreds of thousands of views, despite the obvious problem that Traoré would never address his French-speaking population in English. Everyone in Burkina Faso speaks French, not English. I warned that these fake AI videos are dangerous for multiple reasons. First, they're not faithfully translating what Traoré actually says in French. Second, this fakery creates a weapon that can be turned against Traoré's movement. When you flood the internet with fake content, you make people doubt everything they see. That video cost me over 100 subscribers, and I was destroyed in the comments section. People called me a Western shill simply for suggesting that fake videos of Ibrahim Traoré are not in Africa's best interests. But now I come with receipts because this BBC article specifically highlights the exact kind of fake AI videos I was warning about. Here's the real danger. The average reader in the UK or America now has it planted in their mind that videos about Ibrahim Traoré are fake and cannot be trusted. This broad brush now gets painted on true videos too. Anytime they want to refute real information about African leaders, they can just dismiss it as fake. The flood of AI content has given them the perfect excuse to ignore authentic African voices. This is like scoring an own goal against the African independence movement. We don't need to make the job of the propagandists easier for them. They're already working overtime to discredit our leaders. When we create or share fake content, we're literally doing their work for them. This is how information warfare works. They create the problem, then use that problem to justify censoring the solution. They flood the zone with fake content, then use the existence of fake content to dismiss real content. It's a perfect strategy to silence African independence movements. The resource curse theory from Western academia plays into this narrative. They say Africans can't handle their own wealth. They say foreign management is better for development. This academic theory becomes policy justification for continued foreign control. Continental security implications are also part of the strategy. They don't just attack individual countries, they create regional instability narratives. They say resource nationalism in one country threatens the whole region. They pressure regional organizations like ECOWAS to punish countries that assert sovereignty. They turn African neighbors against each other. The diaspora manipulation is especially cruel. Western media specifically targets African diaspora communities with these narratives. They want diaspora populations to lose faith in their home countries. They want to break the emotional and financial connections between diaspora and homeland. They want to stop diaspora support for independence movements. Iran provides a perfect example of how this escalates. First, they said Iran wanted nuclear energy. Then they said Iran wanted nuclear weapons. Then they imposed sanctions. Then they threatened military action. The resource control became proliferation, concern, became security, threat, became justification for intervention. The same pathway could happen in Africa. Resource sovereignty becomes nuclear ambitions, becomes weapons programs, becomes security threat, becomes military intervention. Niger's uranium control could become the next Iran nuclear crisis. The playbook is already written. For Africans and diaspora communities, recognizing these patterns is crucial for survival. When you see blood gold stories, ask who benefits from this narrative. When you see instability reports, check the timing against resource deals. When you see humanitarian concerns, trace the funding back to strategic interests. Media literacy means questioning sources, timing, and beneficiaries. Who wrote the article? When was it published? What happened right before it came out? Who gains money or power if you believe this story? Who loses money or power if you don't believe it? Historical context shows that every liberation movement faces information warfare. When Ghana got independence, they said Nkrumah was a communist threat. When Congo got independence, they said Lumumba was unstable. When Libya tried to create African financial independence, they said Gaddafi was a dictator. The same patterns repeat over and over. The critical questions you must ask are simple but powerful. Who benefits from this narrative? What's the real timeline of events? What are they not telling us? What would happen if this story is false? What would happen if it's true? Which outcome benefits Western strategic interests more? Anticipatory conditioning is another tool they use. They create moral justification frameworks in advance of military action. They build public opinion slowly over time. They make intervention seem reasonable and necessary. They prepare people to accept regime change as humanitarian rescue. The continental awakening is real and growing. More African countries are demanding control of their resources. More leaders are kicking out foreign military forces. More governments are building local processing capacity. More people are supporting economic independence movements. This success is exactly why the information warfare is intensifying. When Africa was poor and dependent, Western media mostly ignored the continent. Now that Africa is asserting independence, Western media is paying very close attention. The more successful African sovereignty becomes, the more desperate the propaganda becomes. The psychological warfare specifically targets your sense of identity and belonging. They want you to feel ashamed of African governments. They want you to believe that African leadership is inherently corrupt and violent. They want you to think that Western guidance is necessary for African success. But the evidence shows the opposite. Countries that have asserted resource sovereignty are seeing real improvements. They're paying off debt, building infrastructure, and creating jobs. They're investing in education and healthcare. They're developing industrial capacity. Economic independence is working. The nuclear escalation pathway is the most dangerous part of this whole strategy. Once they establish that African resource control is dangerous, they can escalate to nuclear threats. Niger's uranium sovereignty could become nuclear weapons concerns. Mali's gold sovereignty could become terrorism financing. Burkina Faso's mining policy could become regional instability. Every African and diaspora person needs to understand this playbook. When you see blood gold articles, you're seeing economic warfare. When you see instability reports, you're seeing intervention preparation. When you see humanitarian concerns, you're seeing regime change justification. The tools for resistance are information literacy, source verification, and historical pattern recognition. Share real information with your communities. Question mainstream narratives. Support independent African media. Connect with people who understand these patterns. Don't let them redefine liberation as terrorism. Don't let them make you afraid of African success. Don't let them convince you that Western control is better for African people. The blood gold narrative is just the latest weapon in a very old war. When Africa controls its resources, expect the narratives to intensify. The more successful African independence becomes, the more desperate the propaganda will become. They will try everything to maintain control. Information warfare is just the beginning. Your awareness is their weakness. Your understanding breaks their power. Your support strengthens African sovereignty. The future of the continent depends on your ability to see through these lies and stand with African independence. The blood gold narrative is not about protecting African people. It's about protecting Western strategic interests. It's not about preventing conflict. It's about preventing African control. It's not about human rights. It's about maintaining influence. Remember how they used emotional language to manipulate your feelings. Remember how they flipped the script to make victims look like villains. The next time you see blood gold in a headline, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. You'll see the strategic interests behind the moral language. You'll see the information warfare behind the humanitarian concerns. You'll see the regime change preparation behind the stability warnings. This is your education in information warfare. This is your training in narrative recognition. This is your preparation for the battles ahead. Because when Africa controls its resources, the war for your mind has only just begun. So what do you guys out there think? Have you seen the same content being pushed? Let me know in the comments. And if you're a person that's not usually connected to putting comments in and you have nothing to say, would it be too much for me to ask you to write the words "no blood gold" in the comment section? It just lets me know that you've watched the video to the end, you like the channel, you like what I'm talking about, and you want me to continue. I know I say this every time, but I really mean it when I say thank you so much for watching this video to the end, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.